All right, my name's Curt Anderson. I'm going to be the moderator for this particular panel, and I'd like to start out with one of my favorite quotes having to do with skeptical thinking, and it applies to everyone, and sometimes it applies to us more than we like to admit. This is something I need to commit to memory, but I'm going to read it for now. It says, "We use reason primarily to convince others of our intuitions and to justify ourselves. We use intuition and emotions when we decide what we believe." And that's something that we need to get away from. And I think everybody in the panel has, for the most part, and some of us, develop at different speeds, and we have different blind spots, and we're always trying to work through those. It's a process of humanity that continues from, the start to the end of our lives. But what we'll do to start this panel is we'll let everyone introduce themselves. I told you my name is Curt Anderson.
I'm Steve Novella.
I'm Matt Dillahunty.
And I'm Nick Eftimiades.
All right, so to start out, I think maybe we'll maybe each share something where we've discovered a blind spot in our own lives and what led us to do that. Was it something internal or was it something external? Or how do you develop the ability to overcome these blind spots and think critically about things that we think we already are, but maybe we're not?
You want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. It's my journey to skepticism was a long period of time and very iterative. Very piece by piece. I didn't have a lot of suddenly the scales falling from my eyes kind of moments, but there were I have to go back pretty early, really to my 20s, where there were things I definitely believed, for example, that we were being visited by aliens when I was younger, and I do have a memory of when I realized, when you look at it that way, the evidence is bullshit. This is probably not true. This is something, and I realized that my whole approach to a lot of things that I believed was not adequate. It was wrong. So that was what started me really on my journey towards applying skepticism more uniformly, throughout my life, and also learning what that means, because that's a very complicated question,
Right.
Yeah, I think for me, when I first was kind of introduced to the idea of skepticism, I couldn't tell you how old I was fairly young, and immediately my thought was, well, duh. Of course you're supposed to think critically and examine evidence and question things. I've been doing that my whole life. And then every now and then something would creep up. It's like, oh, wait a minute, you're still a Southern Baptist. You're still, you had dreams about witchcraft that scared the crap out of you when you were a kid. You messed around with Ouija boards. You bought into this and this and this. But it was this gradual thing where I started to realize I was making this mistake. And yet every time I would realize I hadn't been operating with a skeptical mindset about caring about what was true and making sure my internal model of reality mapped with reality, I'd be, another one, cool. And then there was like a floodgate where now it applies to everything except for my religious beliefs. And then, of course, there was the awakening that got me away from that as well. And it keeps going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm actually sometimes a little concerned even with myself, because I come across situations where it's pointed out to me that I'm not using skeptical thinking, I'm not using critical, and I really, to be honest, like to think of myself very much as critical analysis, as a critical thinker. It bothers me personally to be failing in that regard, particularly now as I'm a professor. It really bothers me. So, my wife is usually the one to point it out, that I don't know it all. I haven't been thinking critically. And it's not an emotional response, but it's generally my lack of information or understanding, being cognitive bias, and being able to consider an entire situation. So where I can point out some of those things in early life, I think for me, it's a developmental process. And personally, it bothers me that I'm still not through it. I'm as...
And we all fight that to some degree, and I think that's what this panel is about. For me personally, this Skeptic track was a big part of my development in my deconversion from Christianity, I used to come to the Skeptics track, and I got hooked because they had a couple of magicians that I knew of and followed my whole life. And I went and I was like, man, they're so right, and it's so important to think critically about everything, except how do they get the religion thing so wrong? And now, for those of you who don't know, I was a full-time Christian magician, did basically ministry all over the U.S., several other countries.
Is that redundant?
What's that?
A Christian magician?
I don't think so, because I still do magic, and Matt does magic, and neither one of us are Christian now. So, but I was doing only ministry work, and I actually ran across another an atheist magician online, and decided that I would try to convert him. And what I would do is because he was arguing with everybody on this one particular place, and I was like, well, I'll just find out what his objections are, and I'll apply the critical thinking that I'm so good at, and I'll figure out where he's wrong, and then I'll try to figure out how he's going to counter that, and then I'll have a second counter argument, and I'll be a step ahead of him. And I sent him one email. He told me his objections, and I went and searched those out. I never emailed him again, and I found there were so many problems with what I believed that it became, something I could no longer ignore. And through a process of several years, I just decided that it was really more important to understand the truth than to live with what was comfortable. And I was willing to basically give up the most important aspect of my life and what my whole upbringing and my whole life revolved around, and that was work in religion. But I could no longer hang on to it and be truthful with myself. Mm-hmm. And it became even more important for me because my kids were growing up, and I knew that my decisions and the way I faced this dilemma was going to affect them. Mm-hmm. So, now that we've kind of told, how we came out of that, does anybody have a story of a spot where you really blew it? Hey, beyond what we've already discussed, like with religion, we realized, Matt realized it was wrong for him. I realized it was wrong for me. Is there something outside of that maybe you really just one day went, oh my goodness, I really messed this up?
No. Once I got it right, I was done.
You're done, right?
No.
Yeah.
Actually, none that I can talk about.
Yeah, there we go.
That's probably.
We'll ask Nick's wife next year, right? We'll have her come up and be on the panel.
I mean, I think probably the anything where there's any tribalism involved, anything where I felt like there was part of my identity growing up, those were always the last things to go. So I think probably my last conversion, because I was raised Catholic, and I was a Catholic. I believed, never evangelical, not fundamentalist, but there was never any incompatibility between my religion and being and science. But it was more philosophically I had to sort of get rid of the religion, but I was still political. And I think it was a more recent phenomenon where I really realized I can't identify with any political label, because those are blinders. And everyone I know who identifies with any political ideology, that inhibits their critical thinking. They are not objective, and they don't think clearly about any topic that comes up. At the very least, they come out, you tell them something that has a political angle to it, and their immediate take on it is consistent with their ideology. Those blinders, that filter is immediately in place. And that's probably the last one of those filters I got rid of. I just can't identify with any label, because that's a filter I don't need to have and I don't want to have.
Sure. So that actually gets to be a very internal struggle on self-identity. And those things that you see yourself, I mean, in the very essence of everyone here has a belief of what they're like, right? I'm this, I'm that, I would never do this, I never that. These are all labels that you're placing on yourself. And you grow up in your cultural context, your environment reinforces those. And and that really prohibits critical thinking in a lot of ways. The most destructive thing that can happen to you, and I've learned this over years, and testing is borne out. The most destructive thing is the psychological destruction of your self-identity. And that's why so many won't challenge self-identity. You know, oh, I grew up as this, I grew up as that, I don't believe in this. Really takes a lot to shred that internally to then be able to see something critically.
And I have to say, sorry, but I have to say, I think that getting rid of those last shreds of identity, that's tied to ideology, that is generally true within the skeptical movement. And all of the internal conflicts that I've seen among skeptics are because they can't get out of the way of their own politics. That's my opinion. I think that there are skeptics who don't realize that they're still operating with a political filter in place. Yeah. Which to me was a little disappointing. It's like we're the ones who are not supposed to have the filters in place, but they're there.
And sometimes I notice very issue specific.
Yeah.
I mean, even some of us, we can have discussions, and you can talk about subject A, perfect agreement, subject B, subject C, anyone who does that is a dirty rat and should be killed. Yeah. Really, anyone. I mean, globally, you mean that. You can hit an emotional point when critical thinking just goes out the window.
It's incredibly counterproductive for, like, if the three of us or the four of us, we all agreed on one issue and we're working side by side towards that, whether it's, better science education in school or science-based sexual reproductive stuff in school. And it's all great right up until one of us who's a little more stringent than the rest figures out that we disagree on some other point that's relevant. Now we can't work together anymore towards this other goal. Mm-hmm. It's kind of frustrating. I did on my Atheist Debates project, there's 2 videos I put up. They were live like right when DragonCon went live. David McCraney, who does the You Are Not So Smart podcast, has written 2 books, You Are Not So Smart and You Are Now Less Dumb, is finishing up his 3rd book, which is all about changing minds. And he talked to a bunch of psychologists and experts and people doing studies in beliefs, values, and, oh crap, I'm going to forget the 3rd word. But anyway, we had this big, long discussion. And he interviewed me and some other people who are like actively in the trenches of debating and changing people's minds to talk about what had been successful. And one of the things that I didn't point out in that video, in addition to getting comfortable with saying I don't know, and a lot of my debate opponents are very frustrated that I don't walk in with, I don't think you can be absolutely certain about anything, and I certainly don't walk into a debate going, I'm absolutely certain that you are in fact wrong. And they want that. They need that. They need that confidence, which is why some of them have bought into particular ideologies, because it gives them this feeling that they are absolutely certain, even if it's not warranted. And so one of the biggest problems, and I've watched this for years over the show, is people asking the wrong questions. And go back through, for anybody who watches the Atheist Experience on occasion, listen to the actual words of the question. I've had people call in and say, well, if God didn't create the universe, who did? Well, that's an incredible bias right there. I see it in news. CNN did a thing about why do atheists inspire such hatred, as if there's this necessary onus on the atheist for it. But it doesn't even go there. Somebody called the show the other day and was like, where does morality come from? And I'm sitting here thinking, where does health come from? You would never ask that question, and yet if you view those things as roughly similar. So there's baggage we inject into the very questions we're asking, and if you start with baggage in the question, you're not likely to get the right answers. Right. Or at least be confident that you did.
You know what? If you can work through those, if there's civility and understanding and openness on all sides, and you can work through those, that's how we learn. That's how we learn and grow. What I find more the problem, and I see it in academia, I see it in a lot of places, is the inability and the lack of desire to work through any of that. That's hugely, painful, for all of us.
And we let our passions get the better of us a lot. I see it amongst. So I'm with you in that I dodge quite a few labels. There's plenty that apply, generally speaking, but they apply to this point, and then after that, I'm done. But what I see happening a lot now, I gave a talk a few years ago called "Hyperbole Will Destroy the World," and I'm gonna redo that talk and add to it because from my perspective, interacting with people on social media, it's gotten worse because if you disagree with me, you're a Nazi, and if you and I don't exactly share everything, well then I shouldn't have anything to do with you. And what I've seen a lot more of lately from people I respect who consider themselves to be honest is outright lying, and I'm really reluctant to call someone a liar, because to me lying is an intentional act of deception, not just merely being wrong. And yet I see somebody's passionate about an issue and it's perhaps not getting as much attention as they want, and so they begin to exaggerate and then exaggerate and then exaggerate because they're desperate for somebody to pay attention to this issue. And they may be completely right on the issue, but they're alienating everybody who might join along with them because of the exaggerations.
So this might be an interesting thing. I'll start with an example of maybe an encounter with somebody else, and it just was dumbfounding how illogical they were. So as a magician, I do mentalism, and some people think I can read minds, even though I'll tell them in the show, I can't read minds, I can't predict the future, this is all for entertainment. And I'll have people come up afterwards, and I had someone offer me a lot of money to go interpret dreams and things like that. And I was actually on an airplane, and somebody asked what I did, and I told them, and they were like, "Oh, that's incredible. Can you do psychic readings?" And I said, "No. That's all fake. Don't spend a lot of money on that." And they're like, "Really? So there's a lot of fakes out there?" Like, "Yeah." So we started talking about it, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I can see that now. That person's fake, and this person's fake, and I understand." I explained the principles of cold reading and how we make generalizations, and you double speak, and you look for someone to show interest and kind of follow that along. And she goes, "Well, I am so glad we had this conversation. There are so many different psychics out there, and they're scamming people. It's just terrible what they do. I am so glad that the one I go to is real."
I didn't mention this last night. I couldn't even think straight last night because I took an hour-and-a-half show and condensed it to about 20 minutes. The very first time.
How many of you saw Matt last night? Great job, right? Yeah.
The very first time I did the show, we were in Victoria, Canada, and I was running towards the elevator, and I had my bag and my prop and jacket, and there were two women standing in front of the elevator, and of course, I arrived just as the elevator opened, and you get the nice coincidence thing, well, I'll jump in, and I said, "Wow, you guys have got such great timing, I should put you in the show." And of course, then we talked about that, and they said, "Well, what's it about?" And I said, "Well, basically, I'm teaching the basic principles of skepticism to people, and I'm using magic to make it hopefully entertaining and educational." And they said, "Oh, skepticism, yeah. You don't think there's enough skepticism in the world already?" And I was like, uh-oh. And I said, "No, not hardly." Well, one of them looked at me, she said, "We do. I mean, our field is just chock full of skepticism." And I was like, "What field is that?" And she goes, "Health supplements." "Here's 2 tickets to the show. I'll see you there."
But I think the thing that ties all these things together, the political angle versus my psychic is real, and et cetera, is that people often, when they're not being critical thinkers about a specific topic, they think that they are, right? And so what happens is they don't think, "Oh, I'm being critical about this, but I'm just not being a critical thinker about that issue over there." They rather just define critical thinking to incorporate the thing that they want to believe. So yeah, so like if you have a certain ideology, that gets sort of woven into critical thinking, so that's like the version of critical thinking that's real is the one that incorporates my belief, right? So, and I think what we're seeing here. So yeah, there are some psychics who actually advertise or have. They publish websites that are like how to tell fake psychics.
Yeah.
But what they're really saying, it's not that all psychics are fake. Like those psychics are fake, and I'm real.
Right. And some psychics believe that they are real.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And that they're critical thinkers.
And that's the thing is everybody thinks that what you believe is right. Nobody goes, "Well, I know I'm wrong. I'm going to believe it anyway." Right. I mean, that's. If you knew it was wrong, you'd believe something else. It's beyond belief. It's really about how you approach research and understanding the facts and so forth.
So
and
that's actually, I think, the key point in this. That I'm pretty sure if I asked everyone what you thought critical thinking was, could you define critical thinking? I'm sure we get somewhat of a variance. We give sort of an idea, a fuzzy idea of what it is, but I think there'd be a lot of variance in what people think it is and how to approach it. which is what is really lacking. I mean, I see it in college students. I see
Sure.
people can do tons of research, but then being able to analyze data and to say this doesn't fit with that, this is more important than that, all those types of things that really let you crank through the amazing amounts of data that you can come across and decide what might be correct or might not.
And
Those
back
are-
to the
they
quote
don't.
I started with, if you go and look for support to your side of anything, your point of view, if you look for information from critical thinkers, it doesn't matter what you believe, you'll find it. You can always, if you want to find support for what you believe and then believe that you're thinking critically because you found information that backs up your stance, that's not critical thinking. That's reinforcing your own ideas. Find information that's opposite of what you believe and truly understand that and weigh it versus what you believe and see if you're right. That's more what critical thinking is, and that can be a humbling thing to do.
It also challenges your big assumptions.
Sure.
Right? You have very big assumptions.
But if you can do that and you were right to start with,
Yes.
then you're much more informed.
Of course.
So,
And you truly understand the argument.
right. Yeah, if you can truly understand both sides,
Right.
you're at a big advantage when you're dealing with your own life as well as discussing it with other people.
Yeah, in some cases, decisions like this, belief things, are value judgments in people. I mean, and I'll throw out gun control as just an example, that people have a wide variety of opinions on what gun control should be, how much, if, value of the Second Amendment. It's a value statement. I judge this to be more important than that. And that's simple. For whatever reason, you could say lives, you could say, X amount, say, no, this is more important to me. It's a value judgment, and some of that you just can't argue with. I mean, okay, I understand. You value this more than that.
And that's another point I think too, is everything's not black and white.
Right.
There's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of value judgments, and it may be right for you and it may be wrong for me. And obviously there are some things that aren't that way, but we try to make everything too. This is back to the political statement, right? I'm a Democrat. All Republicans are horrible people. I'm a Republican. All Democrats are evil. It's just those are bad walls to put up.
Condoleezza Rice said something which I thought was pretty interesting. She said, relative to the Second Amendment, that she was an absolutist in believing for the Second Amendment. I was pretty surprised about hearing that. And then she explained why, and she said, look, I grew up in Alabama, and I can remember my dad and others in the neighborhood walking around with shotguns because whites were driving through our neighborhood shooting just at the houses, and the police weren't doing anything. So that emotional experience had such an impact on her. I got it. In her head, there's a value judgment there that makes that decision. So it's pretty interesting how people can come up with this.
Yeah, but that issue is a great example because I get tons and tons of emails from self-identified skeptics, people who are trying to be critical thinkers, and then you hit a political hot button issue like that, and they're like, hey, skepticism says you have to be for the Second Amendment or you have to be against it, and they build a case that happens to exactly fit their political ideology, but they think it's the skeptical, the critical thinking case, because you can twist it. You say you're trying to prove yourself right, not prove yourself wrong. And as a skeptic, what you should be doing, like, take the other side, try to prove yourself wrong, and try to make the case for the other side as best as you can. It's always a good thought experiment, but that takes a lot of mental energy. But it's so easy to convince yourself that you're being skeptical when you're really just supporting your biases, and that just comes out to the fore when you have emotionally political issues.
Right.
So gun control is like one of the classic examples.
There are many that we've seen, and I've always found helpful in that regard in taking your baseline assumption. If you can look at your argument and say, okay, that is my assumption in the argument, that violence will go down if I restrict guns, and I'll give you, just throw that out as an example. That's the baseline in the argument. Is it true or not? If you can attack it, you can support it, you can shred and get every study you want to simply support your baseline assumptions. If your baseline assumptions don't hold, okay, you have a problem in your argument. So that's where it all starts, challenging
and doing
ourselves.
that research isn't the first 3 spots on Google and be done either, because they keep track of what you believe and where your slant is,
Right.
and you're going to get that information to start with. So we're close to halfway through, and I find that we almost never have enough time to do questions and answers. So I think we've got a mic right back here. If you've got a question or an idea or a statement, you can get in line. You don't have to touch the mic. These guys are professionals. That thing goes up and down on its own. And this is high tech here. So our first question, yes, sir.
Hang on. At the risk of stealing someone's question, well, I'll save it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And if we get to 2 minutes left, and Matt hasn't told us this, we'll let you end with whatever it is you got to say.
Wait, there's a question for you guys, but
Okay.
yeah.
This question's for Matt. Matt, I recently watched the debate you did with Jordan Peterson, and he comes out at the beginning, takes a pregnant pause, puts his hands up thoughtfully, and then criticizes everybody in the room for not taking this question of does God exist seriously enough. And it was almost like a very passive-aggressive attempt at controlling the course of the narrative or the rest of the argument. And I know on your show you treat people that call in very differently than how you approach debates, which I think is appropriate.
There's several reasons for that.
Right.
One is that I have 5 other callers waiting to go to, and when I'm on stage, it's just me and whoever's there, and I can't hang up on them.
But I wanted to get your perspective on how you felt about him, that debate in general, and perhaps his opening salvo there.
Oh, I'm gonna duck because it's a long conversation that doesn't necessarily fit this. But I also did an entire video that's a half hour to an hour long with all of my thoughts about what happened in that conversation with him. It wasn't the opening that bothered me as much. It was his rabid fans coming in to tell me that I just hadn't understood him, and then I went back and watched the video, and he said the thing that I said that he had said, and his fans were like, no, that's not what he said, that's not what he meant. And the big issues for me were how little he seemed to understand secular humanism, atheism, and was basically putting up a straw man, saying basically if you were a real atheist, you would rationalize murder. So since you don't do that, you're clearly not a real atheist. And I really wanted to get more into skepticism because his daughter is pushing this meat-only diet, and he and his wife have bought into it. Like I went to dinner with the man before the event, and literally it was, clean the grill, cook me a steak, bring it out, I'll put some salt on it, and that's it. And evidently, according to him, he's only eating meat. And while I'm not a medical professional,
That's not good for you.
yeah. So I may not have to worry about having a second conversation with him, but I'm open to it. Yeah. But yeah, the video's up on the Atheist Debates thing.
But talk about bias, though. Again, the rabid fan thing. It's like he didn't say what you think he said, but it's on video. Like that, and of course we see this politically too. It's like Trump never said that. Here's a video. That's not what he said. He didn't say
Or
that.
it's
That's
not
fake.
what he meant.
Right.
Yeah, that's fake. Now I've got on that too. But here it is. It's a video. Yeah, that video is fake. It's like, okay, you know that how? I mean, could be. Things could be faked, but the casual assumption that whatever goes against your belief system is not real. Now, it's confirmation bias on steroids.
All right, next.
Hi, longtime skeptic, and I always feel like I'm a critical thinker, but my 2 biggest issues are biases that I don't see until they're in the past. Somebody points it out, and I'm like, how have I not realized that? And knowledge that's been common knowledge my entire life. We use 10% of our brains, and it just
We also use the other 90.
Never occurs to me to question that. How can I see those coming at me instead of waiting until somebody goes, hey, good.
Just always ask yourself, wait a minute, is this really true? I mean, you have to learn that to build. It's like you click the seatbelt when you get into the car, to the point that at some point, if you don't do it, you feel something wrong, So it just has to become a reflex. Wait a minute, is this really true? And it's hard to do it 100% of the time, all the time. And even it happens to me. Like I do a show every week, and we throw things out there that I thought I knew and I thought was true. It's like, wait, shit, I didn't question this recently enough, or whatever, or my memory has shifted over the years, and now it's wrong somehow, and I didn't think to go back and like recalibrate what I thought was true. It's constant. You do have to constantly do that. Obviously, you have to live your life too, so you have to decide what's important enough, to expend the energy, but at least say, oh, I haven't vetted this recently, so I don't really know, right? So be comfortable saying I don't know, and then only really be confident that this is probably true if you've reasonably vetted it in a skeptical, critical thinking way. So you just have to build that in to your way of thinking.
Do some kind of reward system too. When you realize that you've done that, congratulate yourself for doing it, because Dr. Novella and I are probably different from most people doing weekly shows. We're like entrenched in an onslaught of questions and people who disagree, and we're out representing ourselves to everybody else. Most people don't live their lives like that. Most people just, today's pretty much the same as yesterday, and I don't have to question that much, and you're probably going to be right more often than not, otherwise you'd be dead. It's the big things you got to push.
But I will say, you guys doing that and being here have honed my critical thinking skills, and I'm certain that goes for these others too. So
thanks. But I do want to say, go ahead.
Can I suggest, send me an email, and I've done some writing on just how to think critically, how to do critical analysis, and it just might give you ideas on, I heard a story, now I know how to break down that story and look. And at least next time you look, you'll have that. And alternatively, you could live with my wife for a month and she'll show exactly how wrong you are.
Well, it is true. Having the person in your life who is your reality check is really useful. Somebody else will give you a different perspective. But there was this point at which I realized, shit, my head is full of misinformation and inaccurate stuff that's just not true. Today, it's still full of it. I know that there are things that I think are correct that aren't. It just has to be statistically true. And so, anyway, you just have to just remember that's the case. And if something's important, check it. Just really check it out, because it's probably at least a little wrong, if not significantly wrong.
Hey guys, so I find that in my social and career aspects of my life that, as the years go on, there's just so many false beliefs and junky ideas that people seem to glom onto. And I've developed kind of a reputation for being somewhat of a prude at work and other places. I'm always respectful, but I'm talking the entire spectrum from talking heat out of burns to I know a guy that believes in reptilians. I guess my question would be, how do I promote critical thinking in my life? What's a good way to do it? Because I get discouraged. Sometimes I just want to divorce myself from it and just let people go on being goofy. But at the same time, I know that I can't do that. So I guess my question is, what is a good way to promote critical thinking to people in our lives?
I have a good book for you. So we do have a chapter on that in the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe book. Exactly that. How do you be the skeptical person in your work environment, in your social circle, without being an asshole, right? Or without being exhausting, like, oh, that guy again, And there's a balance there, and there's a lot of tips on how to do that. Like, don't hit people over the head with things necessarily. I think you tend to be more successful if you sort of come at things at the back door, like engage their skepticism about things that they're not that passionate about, right? You can't just tell people they're wrong. You have to give them critical thinking skills. So the reptilian, it's like the guy who believes in the reptiles are running the world. It's like, well, I wonder how, if that were true, how would we know that is true? Just ask them sort of those open-ended questions and see what they say. Or find something that they don't believe in and say, well, okay, how do we know that that's not true? And then see if you can sort of engage that skepticism. Again, you're just asking questions, but you're leading them to thinking in a critical way, and they're going to apply it to their cherished beliefs or not. You're not going to force them to do that. You cannot make them be skeptical or get rid of these beliefs, but you can give them critical thinking perspectives and skills, and eventually they may apply it to those things, but you have no control over that. And that's sort of the final thing, is to realize you don't have control over what these other people believe. So you could be the voice of reason, and people will come to respect you and acknowledge that that's who you are, and that they'll accept you for that, and as long as you are not an asshole. But you could still be the voice of reason, but you could do it sort of in this sort of nurturing, way, And that tends to, everyone knows like where I worked and I'm the skeptic, and they'll come to, oh, Steve will have an opinion about this. He's the skeptic. What do you, should I believe in this thing? It eventually just becomes part of your persona that everyone accepts.
But I think that's a really good point. And I think it's set the example or lead by example, right? So I'm that way, actually probably too much so. I'm a little more the asshole that people, and I'm really? Well,
No, I'm the asshole.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but you're paid for it.
And I think the Socratic method is probably the best tool we
Right,
have,
right,
because
right.
this is how, just by asking questions, you can get people to come to a realization on their own. And that's always, when you come to a realization on your own, that's always going to be much more impactful than somebody just telling you you're wrong and you're like, okay, I guess I'm wrong.
Get them to debunk themselves.
Yeah, and you're not responsible for them to if they don't listen to you. You can't want something for somebody else more than they want it for themselves. And along these same lines, people will give you opportunity. Example I was sharing with Matt earlier this week, when I told my brother that I was no longer a Christian, it just blindsided him, and we talked about it a little bit, and he basically didn't want to talk about it after that. And my brother's really, really intelligent. And a few months later, he called me. He said, man, you're not going to believe this. I was at a Christmas party, and this guy there who's an engineer, like he's really, really smart. And he tells me that he believes that the earth is flat. And I thought he was kidding. And he pulled up, he's got 90 videos on his phone. He's got all these books and all these things and everything. He's going through all this stuff. He's like, it just bewilders me that someone that's that smart has taken all their time to convince themselves that the earth is flat. And I was like, well, what about gravity? And it's like, gravity doesn't exist. Things just fall. And he says, he's got all these things, and it makes no sense. How can someone that smart just be that far off? I said, this is exactly how I feel about you and religion.
Did it
That's
click?
all I had to say. No. No.
That was the click. That's an anachronism. But so, do you see the movie Behind the Curve? So about the flat Earth thing, I highly recommend it, Behind the Curve. But there's a moment like that in the movie where a woman who believes the world is flat and it's a massive conspiracy. There's people that are even nuttier than her who thinks that she's part of a conspiracy, right? And so she's having this conversation with the director. It's like, I know that they're wrong because I know I'm not working for the CIA, and yet they've managed to convince themselves that this is true. I wonder if I'm doing that. And then she had that Theodoric of York moment. Nah, but she was right there, so it's like the same thing. It's like, yeah, but that's how you get people to realize it. You get them to realize what someone else is doing, and then you just got to turn that mirror in a little bit. But of course, we're all trying to do that. That process never ends. Even if you're a career skeptic, you still constantly have to remind yourself to turn those mirrors in on yourself, because the default mode, right, of human behavior, the pathway of least resistance, is to think, oh, I'm already there. Everything I believe is perfectly critically thinking, but it never is.
Thank you, guys. I'll definitely check that book out.
By the way, along with that documentary, which is phenomenal, everybody was like, you need to go watch this, and I resisted it. And then when they proved themselves wrong, I was like, yay! There's another documentary that may still be on Netflix, which I recommend as often as I can. It's called Room 237.
Oh, love it.
It is, I've watched it half a dozen times. I introduce it to everybody, but it is a look at Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and there's no narrator telling you what the position is. Instead, they just let different people talk about their conspiracy theory about that movie and what it's about. It will give you probably one of the best peeks into the mind of how people build conspiracies and how people can look at the same thing and see 20 different things.
Yeah.
Hey, what I wanted to talk about was the fact that occasionally we have, particularly in politics and current events, where people don't realize that they're talking about two sides of the same issue, and that they're not seeing it from each other's perspective, because they're seeing it, and this is particularly true with symbolism and with flags. And I see this a lot with the American flag, how you have ex-military or people that have grown up very patriotic and believe that this is what the American flag stands for, versus like possibly a Black Lives Movement that see the American flag standing for something completely different. And so they're not really talking about the same thing. They're not talking about exactly, because it's a flag, it's a symbol, it means something to you. It doesn't, it's not a thing within itself. It's just a piece of fabric. And I don't see many people speaking about the fact that you're talking about one thing and you're talking about something else. And how do you get those people to realize that it's a symbol and it doesn't intrinsically mean something?
You know, Napoleon said that it's amazing what some people will do for a piece of ribbon. You know, and a very serious, symbols are hugely important in civilization. I mean, they really are. You might work that way out, but it is a piece of, you know, it's a piece of cloth at the end of the day. But symbolism is a huge part of civilization at this point.
That reminds me of a meme. I have to tell you this story. So it's there's a picture that was going around the internet. I think it was maybe a year or two ago, and it was of some brown people flipping the bird at Mount Rushmore. And of course, this is going around, the conservative, internet. And the caption was, if you don't love America, then go home. Of course, they were Native Americans. And so they were here first. And their perception of American symbols may be different than ours, and you got to cut them a little bit of slack, So, but to the other side, they completely interpreted it differently. But I think, your point is a good one, and I think what you're saying is people often talk past each other. And why does that happen? Well, how do people talk past each other? It's because thinking is hard. It's not easy. There's a lot of different ways your thinking can go wrong. And the worst way is in ways that you're not even aware it can go wrong, right? So like often people make what we call a category mistake. What is that? Well, if you don't know what a category mistake is, you don't know if you're making one. And that's why I think everyone really needs to study a little bit of philosophy, because that teaches, that's the thing I think is underrepresented in skeptical movement, in skepticism, is we tend to focus on science and psychology and things like that. It's all great, all very important, but philosophy is so damn important.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Yeah, because you don't know you're thinking wrong.
Yeah.
That's usually what's happening. So like, again, people don't realize, well, you're talking about values and I'm talking about evidence. So there's two different kinds of things. We're never going to resolve it. Or you're making this assumption as a starting point without acknowledging it. And I'm making a different assumption about the same point without acknowledging it. We're never going to meet in the middle because we have different premises. So if you don't break down what it is, how you're thinking about things and how you're addressing the issues and what the issue is and how do you know, if you don't have a process of how to think about things, you get to a place of, you could start out with completely unresolvable premises. So, again, there's no easy answer to that, because thinking is hard. So the answer is equally hard. It means you have to spend our whole life trying to think better, right? And that includes understanding at least a working knowledge of philosophy. I think you need to have a working knowledge of science, you need to have a working knowledge of psychology, and you need to have a working knowledge of philosophy to really be able to think about complicated things.
In any debate, the first thing people are going to suggest is define your terms. And that's there so that you don't talk past each other. Right. Well, as somebody who's done a fuck ton of debates, including ones where we spent hours.
Ton, is that a measurement?
It's almost not quite a metric fuck ton, but where we'd spent hours and hours and hours beforehand, setting the ground rules, defining terms, only to find out that there was a term we missed, or that despite all that effort, just 2 weeks ago, I debated a guy who's got a degree in philosophy, and I figured there were some things we could probably skip. So we start the debate talking about how we both have presuppositions, and then we get to the end of the debate, and he has a completely different definition of presupposition than anybody on the planet, pretty much. So just get used to the fact that it's going to happen. And as soon as you get to the point in the conversation where it feels like you might be talking about two different things again, go back to those definitions and refine them as need be. Don't assume that just because you agreed on the definition that you were probably talking past each other then, too.
Or the other moment is when the conversation's gone full circle, right? You've now returned to the starting point without really changing. So we need to do some work here because this is not working. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have a question for you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the issue of philosophy and in the way we think.
Yeah.
I see a movement towards science, technology. STEM subjects are moving up. They're the best paid coming out of college,
yeah.
and there's where societal emphasis is going. But I really see a lack of that type of thinking for the sake of civilization, you know, and how we define arguments and how we decide things. And this should be our renaissance in a sense.
I agree.
This should be the time that surges forward for all civilization. And it's interesting. I don't see it. I don't know if.
No, I agree. I think that I like to remind people that our founding fathers were philosophers, right? The Age of Enlightenment came out of philosophical thinking. And, all the things that we sort of value extremely a lot, and I think that it's no coincidence that they were Enlightenment philosophers. That's how you make profound change. And I agree. I think the time when it smacks me in the face is when a scientist, maybe a well-known scientist, maybe a well-known science communicator, says something profoundly naive about philosophy, usually amounting to something like, well, we don't need philosophy, or this isn't a philosophical question, when in fact they're doing philosophy without realizing it, and they're just doing it wrong because they don't realize they're doing it. And
it's all philosophical questions.
That's right. That's science. It has a philosophical basis,
right.
And so if you don't even know you're doing philosophy, you're probably doing it wrong because you're just right. So it's a pretty good rule of thumb, and and luckily we have some philosophers in the skeptical movement, and we really need to value their contribution more than I think we are.
And one of the best bits of advice I got, kind of heavy-handedly from my wife, ex-wife, whatever. On the show, if somebody would have an argument that was fallacious, I would just point out what the fallacy was. I almost never do that anymore. And I got home from the show one day, and there was a virtual frying pan ready to beam me over the head, saying, "Please stop saying argument from ignorance, because they don't know what fallacies are, and they think you're calling them stupid." And the other thing is, for the people who do know fallacies by name, but don't know why fallacies are significant at all because they couldn't put together a syllogism or understand the difference between validity and soundness, those basic things, that the foundations of epistemology and how to put together an argument, whether or not the premises are sound, etc., that's the bare minimum that people need to know, because you're going to argue every day. And you're going to be presented with information every day, and we're surrounded by propaganda. The internet's been a great tool, loads and loads and loads of information, but it's perhaps information overload because, as Curt was pointing out, you can find evidence for whatever position you want. You can find somebody in a lab coat to say you're right no matter what you're saying. And now the big thing is, now there's so much information. How do I figure out which authorities to listen to? Right. I don't have any way to do that. I don't have the time. I've got a job. I've got a family. We've got bills. We've got these things.
That time is a huge issue.
And it's
go with what feels good
then.
Yeah, so people just go with what fits what they already want to believe.
Or what the people around them are doing.
All right, let's try to get a couple more questions in and have time for Matt's question for the panelists. Oh, that was your question.
I worked it in.
That was nice. That was nice. Subtle, direct, awesome. Next question.
So I'd like to hear from the entire panel on this. As an example, I've heard people criticize like Bill Nye for engaging with Ken Ham on the whole evolution thing, saying that he just gave his views credence and gave him a platform. So what do you guys think about people engaging with intellectually dishonest people like Jordan Peterson, for example? Is that just giving them another platform and putting their views on a level playing field?
So I would say yes and no. I think that I am also happy to do debates myself, but I have certain ground rules, and you have to consider the risks and benefits, right? So what's the venue, and what is the format, and who's the audience, right? So if Dwayne Gish had a career as a creationist going around debating evolutionary biologists, and he set the stage, he set the format, he had the premise, and it was his audience. And he was just firing up his creationist audience, and he eviscerated evolutionary biologists because he was controlling all the levers. That was a perfect example of how not to do a debate, I think. I think Bill Nye's debate was fine because the audience, there was a specific audience for that. It wasn't just like Ken Ham's people. He wasn't trying to convince Ken Ham of anything, and he didn't even really spend any time responding to him. He was just saying, this is how evolution works. He really was just laying it out there for a broader audience, and because he was Bill Nye, the science guy, people don't listen to him, as a science communicator. So it was a good opportunity for him to talk about evolution to a broader audience. So I thought that, at the end of the day, I thought that worked. So I don't think you can give any one, in my opinion, there's no one answer. It's all those details matter. And just be careful. If you're going to do a debate, just be careful about how you're going to go about doing it and all those details. But you have the most experience debating, so what do you tell us what you think?
I only disagree with one thing that you said. I was livid when I found out that Bill was going to debate Ken Ham. I thought he did great. I had to watch the debate live in a different room from my wife because I was yelling at Bill made some mistakes that he left openings, but it turns out Ken Ham is such a terrible thinker and debater that he never took advantage of those openings. And the problem is that Ken Ham's ministry was in shambles and was bleeding money. And this, outside of presidential debates, might have been the most watched debate in the history of the planet. And it definitely revitalized his ministry. It's a win-win for Ken Ham when he can say, hey, we debated the scientists and we won, so now we need money to do these other things. Or we debated the scientists and we lost, and now I need money to this. And that's exactly what happened, and he got money, and that's the reason why there's an art park, and we're dealing with that stuff. Richard Dawkins and I had a conversation once about this because Bill Craig was desperate to debate him, so much so that he did the empty chair bit at one point. And Richard and I were talking about it, and he kind of asked what I thought, which shocked me because I didn't know he would care what I thought. But I said, I don't want you to debate Bill Craig. I want you out there educating people about science and everything else. I don't want you to necessarily elevate him or anybody else. But what I will do is say, if he keeps hounding you because he won't debate me, why don't you agree to do a team debate? Let Bill show up with whoever he wants. You and I show up. I'll do all the work. You sit there, write your next book, and I will wipe the floor with the other two guys, and we'll move on from there. But the thing to remember is debate is theater. It's not about, I don't look at them as win-lose. I don't look at them as WWE events like some other people did, although I did just say I would wipe the floor with them, so maybe I do a little bit. But by and large, it is about making a connection with the audience. And that's one of the reasons why I liked what Bill did, and I thought it resonated with a lot of people. I've debated in Baptist churches, 500 people, and 10 or 15 are atheists who are friends of mine. I want to be there. I want to be in that room with that particular audience, because the one advantage I have over Richard in that environment is he walks in and, oh, well, this is an elite Oxford intellectual doctor. He's got no credibility. I was them, and they cannot deny that. And at that debate that I did with Mike Lacona, one of the deacons from my former church came up to basically say, oh, we thought you were going to be a preacher. What happened? I'm obviously pro-debating, because I view it as education, and I view it as an opportunity to reach out to the other people. And I'm not trying to convince the person I'm debating or change them as much as give information to everybody else and hope that some of it sticks. But that doesn't mean that every debate's a good idea. And I'm a dilettante. I'm a self-taught jackass that, will argue almost anything. I don't need actual scientists giving credence to creationism and elevating that. Let R and Ra do that. Let me do that. Let's let the science people do what they're good at.
That's a fair point, although Bill Nye's not a scientist, he's a science communicator.
Right.
And I agree. I mean, that we were on the fence about it, and I thought, and at first I was against it, but then at the end of the day I thought, oh, maybe, and he got a book out of it, Bill Nye did. I thought maybe the benefit outweighs the risks. I know it's going to give a shot in the arm to the other side, always going to do that. What was the net effect for society? I don't know. I kind of thought it might have been positive at the end of the day because of how much play Bill Nye got and got a book out of it, et cetera. But you could be wrong. You're absolutely right. Who knows? It's risk versus benefit, I think, is the approach.
It's impossible to say, because you could look at this. I remember when I first got involved with the skeptic community at large, after I found my way out of religion and everything else, I was so enthusiastic. Mm-hmm. I mean, you had Mythbusters on TV, you had everybody was active and oh my gosh, everything. And now I live in a world where a shocking number of people evidently think the earth is flat, where we still haven't convinced people that the autism vaccine connection is garbage. And I'm hearing more and more from people that it's just well, there's no way to prove any of this, and science changes its mind every day or so, so I'm just going to stick with where I've been. And I go back to like Pinker's book about Better Angel of Our Nature, and that at least gives me a little hope that things are improving even when they seem like they're not. Like we may have taken a step backwards at some point.
All right, we've got less than 5 minutes. We'll take next question. Hopefully have time for the gentleman behind you too, but if we don't, sorry, we're going to try.
You just mentioned hope. I guess I'm asking for advice. I started Christian, very fervently so, deconverted about 8 years ago. A few years ago, started thinking, maybe, hopefully. And I thought I was told that people were created in the image of God, which in my family meant they were intelligent and could think and were also innately good. I feel very little reason to believe that, and I'm pissed. And I don't know what to... Well, yeah, that's... any advice for an angry person who's kind of on that path and is kind of looking for some hope for humanity and such?
Curt, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's likely to be the toughest thing you ever do. I lost my mother to breast cancer, and I love my mother dearly, and I miss her every day. And that loss was not as difficult to handle as losing religion for me. It's just because it was so ingrained in my identity and my family and my bubble and my friends and my circle. Like I realize my entire life has to change. It's taking it step by step. It's finding out that there's a lot more people. See, here's the other thing. Like I was taught growing up, there's no such thing as an atheist, and people that claim to be are dishonest and they're evil and they're terrible people, and they'll sacrifice children or whatever and all that kind of stuff, right?
Not quite there, but...
Right. Again, it just depends on your family, and every situation is different, but you'll find that the skeptic community, the agnostics, the atheists, the critical thinkers, the humanists, there's a lot of love there, because to me, my decisions and the things that I do now are more important than they were when I was a Christian. Because to me, the world couldn't get too good or too bad because God was in control. I couldn't screw up too much. God's in control, right? He'll direct my paths or whatever. It doesn't matter how we take care of the earth because God's in control. It's going to end when he says it ends. Without God, I realize that every decision I make affects this world. It affects everyone around. And so when you start to realize the importance of you and your decisions, and you take that responsibility, for me, that helped me to deal with that loss. I realized that actually things are more important now. And it's still going to be frustrating to deal with family or friends or people that have a different point of view. But like I said in one of the earlier discussions today, there are a lot of organizations, all over the U.S. Find the local secular humanists, find Free Thought Society, find some of these different organizations. And if you're not aware of those, Derek here can put you in touch with several people that are here this week, and find people in your area that you can communicate with and kind of change your circle of friends and find those people that can help you with your critical thinking, help you with your relationships, help you with that transition. Because it's really, I went through it with my wife, and I cried together for like every day for months because we felt totally isolated. And I think the worst thing you can do in life is isolate yourself. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, was a brilliant man who isolated himself, and he had no one to sound his ideas off of. He could be wrong just a little bit, but like a bad golf shot, you can be off 1 or 2 degrees, but if you hit that sucker 300 yards, you're in the woods way over there. And so you're going to feel like you're on a path by yourself. I would recommend finding people in your area that can help you and give you that support you need.
Do you mind me asking, how old are you?
30 years old, that's fine.
Okay. I was just trying to put it in place in life.
And we got 30 seconds. Catch me afterwards. One more quick question, and we're going to have like a really short question and answer on this one, and then we're going to be done.
All right. Well, this is more of a thought than a question, so it may be shorter than it needs. Than it could.
That'd be great.
One thing that keeps coming up is mental blocks associated with identifying with particular things. identifying with a political answer or a religious answer, and then when you find out that's wrong, it creates a lot of cognitive dissonance. And it seems to me that a potential defense against that is to avoid identifying with facts and try to identify with values rather than facts, because you can always be wrong about the facts.
Yeah, I agree. We say we identify with the process, not the outcome.
Right.
Right. So we have to have a skeptical, critical thinking process that leads to wherever, and that conclusion is going to change over time. Don't plant your flag in any conclusion, because you have to be flexible. Once you do, then you start defending that conclusion rather than following the process to wherever it goes. So I agree with that.
Great. Hey, thanks for coming out. Give these guys a hand here.